Welcome to my mini lecture on Shelley Streeby's Imagining the Future of Climate Change, World Making Through Science Fiction and Activism. Specifically, I'm going to focus on Chapter 2, Climate Refugees in the Greenhouse World, which can be found from pages 69 to 100. So please join along. Before proceeding further, it's worth returning to the title and briefly meditating on the concepts broached. Imagining the future of climate change, world making through science fiction and activism. The key concept animating Streeby's book is the idea of world making, and the idea that world making is central to science fiction, all forms of futurism, and speculative fiction. That's a key insight animating science fiction studies, right? The idea that science fiction is one of the most utopian genres, and that it delinks itself from the logic of the present and helps us imagine worlds radically different than our own, right? So, in this sense, science fiction and futurisms decolonize our imagination. And again, we could see this in the work of Octavia Butler and other fiction writers that Streeby studies. But to me, the really important and radical gesture is to read science fiction alongside with um, activist movements, such as the protest against the North Dakota pipeline, right? And that, as Strebe argues in these alternate chapters, both social protests and science fiction should be read in relationship to each other, and that both are engaged in a form of world making and co-producing concepts to help create a more socially just and environmentally just future. So, chapter 2 centers on Octavia E. Butler, just one of the most important American writers. Wrote in a variety of genres of science fiction, futurism, speculative fiction. And again, her life is documented in Streeby's chapter, but I want to highlight where Streeby did her work, right, and the importance of archival research. So Streeby spent significant time in the Huntington Library, as she states, which is in San Marino, California. San Marino is adjacent to Butler's birthplace in Pasadena, California. And just this opportunity, right? The Octavia Butler collection has more than 8,000 items, including her unpublished book drafts, diaries, research, her notes, her letters. And in combing through all this information, Strebe found how much that Butler was deeply thinking about the world around her, right? Clipping out articles about global warming, about refugees that Butler recognized was being caused by um, our our way of life that is fueled by the fossil fuel industry. So Butler was clipping out all these articles and making notes on them, and her study of the socio-political world informed her fiction. And before moving on, again, especially for graduate students and undergraduate students, the importance of thinking about archives and to study what archives are around us, right? What stores of wealth of information exists on your favorite authors, whether that's in Chicago or Milwaukee or Kenosha. I mean, any small city, like just see what archives they have. And that's such a wonderful research opportunity. And really, it's this chapter that I think got Streeby's book published, right? The remarkable work she does is combing through this archive. On page 95, 96, we read, Butler drew on her extensive research files on refugees and displaced people, notable including several articles about the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees in Camp Pendleton, California, and imagining Lauren as a kind of refugee. These materials prompted her to think about how migration and demographic changes perpetuated new forms of slavery and disposable labor around the world. Her parable novels are full of characters who have been forced to endure various kinds of slavery, from indentured labor to sex slavery to border workers, where companies take advantage of the deregulated zone to push workers ever harder and authorize the worst abuses, in a significant distortion of labor conditions in the US Mexico borderlands in the wake of the 1991 North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Since Butler dreamed up Lauren Alamina over a century ago, her concept of climate refugee, and the text continues. Several things to highlight in this passage. One is something that we were stressing in the first weeks of class, that we should read fiction or literature as doing the work of theory. As Streeby states at the end of this lengthy quote, climate refugee is not a concept that was necessarily created by a scholar. It's a concept that emerged from fiction. And that Butler, in her clippings of various articles and thinking about how radically climate change was happening, linked together these narratives of displaced peoples, specifically mentioned in this quote, the Vietnamese refugees, but linking that the refugee crisis is a climate change crisis. And a few things to sort of highlight, and again, animating Streeby's project. The story of climate change is a deeply human story, but even more specifically, to say it's a human story is a generalization and an abstraction. It's a story that's rooted in the lives and narratives of communities of color, and that we need to begin to frame our narratives of climate change in the voices and writings of African Americans, Indigenous Americans, Latinx Americans, etc. And of course, not just Americans, right? Like globally also. But too much of the discourse on climate change is tethered to white voices and white narratives. But the second thing just to highlight is one is this idea of climate refugee becomes a sort of human story, the human side of climate change that's being experienced in the present and not in some distant future. And relatedly, as Parable highlights and as this quote highlights, these new world conditions generates new forms of slavery. And I want you to be attentive to that as you read Parable of the Sower and other texts, right? Especially science fiction books created by marginalized authors. How do they see these new forms of slavery developing because of a world being produced by climate change? There's so many rich concepts introduced in Streeby's work. Um, there are multiple ones on page, and I just want to maybe just highlight one or two before moving really to the meat of this mini lecture. The first is waste landing on page 69. Powerful Indigenous futurism. Again, that's Indigenous American science fiction, and the importance of calling it Indigenous futurism, right? Just as Strebe makes the case, we shouldn't just say science fiction as a generalizable term, which again, the default position is a white male, but specify, right? African American futurism, or Chicano futurism, or Latinx futurism. But anyway, Indigenous futurism, it emerges in the face of ongoing battles over resource extraction and the wastelanding of indigenous places in the U.S. Southwest and elsewhere in the Americas. And the verb wastelanding may not be familiar to many of us. If we turn back to page 44, Strebe defines wastelanding. And it's a concept that comes from Tracy Voiles, which I'm going to turn to her work in just a moment. It's defined as the extraction of resources in racialized spaces that, combined with environmental racism, renders space marginal, worthless, and pollutable. Such a rich idea and a concept. And to think about, not just in Butler's parables, but in other fictions, where do we see this process of wastelanding being narrated, being represented, and conversely being critiqued in fictional spaces? And I highly recommend turning to Tracy Voigt's work, Wastelanding. Here's just a snapshot of the book from which it comes from, which looks at the Iranian mines and mills in the Navajo Nation and the sort of poisoned that has seeped into this land from the 1940s, right? It was really powerful, and how this ostensibly autonomous land have, as the summary says, quote, long supplied U.S. nuclear weapons and energy programs, end quote, to the dominant U.S. culture. And again, to think about how much our canon, our U.S. canon, in its dominant formation, does not read these Navajo narratives, right? Um, Not just narratives set in the past where they become easier to consume and critique, but narratives in the present that talk about this process of wastelanding, this racialized project, and how the Navajo Nation is feeding into the dominant US energy culture, and to realize that the battles unfolding in the Navajo Nation today are battles related to climate change. But rather than dwell on the dystopian aspects of Butler's science fiction, I want to highlight the positive turns that Butler develops in the utopian imagination, strewn in her very dark and bleak novel. And again, turning to Streeby, a few concepts I want to highlight that we can collectively think about, and one of them being mutualism. I'm reading from Streeby, page 70. Butler's lament that all we do is destructive presupposes the value of mutualism over the kinds of parasitism encouraged by neoliberalism, which imagines a world made up of isolated individuals competing with each other to turn resources into property and extract profit in ways that supposedly are best for everyone. And to unpack that just a little bit, right, the world we live in right now we might call neoliberal capitalism, which imagines all of us as isolated individuals in competition for resources, right? But Butler's trying to imagine a different world order, a different economy that's predicated on mutualism. And one really interesting way to read Butler's work, and not just Butler, but others as well, is where those passages that suggests um, new forms of mutualism, or where we see mutualism in action. And mutuality does not just have to be between human characters, but also between human and non human actors, right? Animals, bacteria, the landscape. Where do we see this mutualistic symbiotic relationships unfolding? Another word for mutualism is symbiosis. And again, citing from Streeby again, Butler often used the language of symbiosis to think about human and non human animals' future on the planet. And again, symbiosis or symbiotic is the recognition that we're mutually dependent on each other, that we co produce the world together, that our lives are enabled and predicated upon symbiotic relationships with untold countless others, right? Again, not just human others, but animal others. To make a very obvious point, we don't eat unless we have a symbiotic relationship with the non human world. Interestingly, if we look at the glossary of Imagining the Future of Climate Change, which begins on 147 and ends on 149, there are only 4 words included that Strebe wants us to memorize and internalize. They are direct action, speculative fiction, world making, and the 4th is symbiosis. I'm reading from page 148. Symbiosis, uh, the Greek roots of the word refer to living together, companionship, and partnership, right? As Strebe highlights, as Butler wrote about continuously, we need new narratives that highlight the way that our lives are rooted in living together in various forms of companionship and partnership. And again, companionship is not limited to humans, that's non human animals as well. We're partnered, we're co partnered all the way down. This is citing Strebe again. Octavia E. Butler imagines symbiotic entanglements among humans, critters, and the earth that belie myths of isolated competitive individuals. End quote. Those myths, of course, are capitalist myths or neoliberal myths. As a bonus, it's interesting to think about Butler's category of symbiotic and map that onto Donna Haraway's work and her thinking about sympoiesis versus autopoiesis. And I'm taking this from Donna Haraway's essay, Staying with the Trouble, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Thulacine, a word that does not roll off the tongue, which is included in Jason Moore's collection, Anthropocene or Capitalocene. You can find this on pages 34 to 76. And basically, poesis, of course, is from the Greek for making, but autopoesis or autopoetic um, narratives or myths are those that are favored by capitalism, according to Donna Haraway, right? It likes to believe that systems are closed, that societies are closed, that we can have society with a capital S that is distinct from nature, in which nature is external to society. And in contrast, what Haraway is is challenging for all of us is to create new narratives that are rooted in sympoesis, right? And again, poesis is making and sim is with. That the ways we could see that again, we're entangled into this web of life, and we need more narratives that move beyond the autopoiesis of the human with a capital H, and show how human communities are enabled by having a symbiotic relationship with the wider ecological world, with the wider non-human world, and this is what she's calling sympoiesis.